Hello! I'm Miss Markham, and I am going to be your teacher for Pathology 1. Here's the deal. You should have your PowerPoint printed and ready to go, your textbook, your trusty textbook by your side and ready to be flipped through when I refer to a table or a chart that will make you smarter. And other than that, we just got some good learning to do. So let's get started. The relationship between impairment and functional limitations is the key focus in therapy. You have to understand the pathology to treat the patient. Let's define pathology. Read along with me. Pathology is a branch of medicine that investigates the essential nature of disease, especially changes in body tissues and organs that cause or are caused by disease. Pathology is the science of the cause and effect of diseases. Does the pathology really matter all that much about our approach to rehabilitation? Yeah, absolutely. At the minimum, you must understand the basics of the pathology affecting your patient in order to provide safe and effective rehabilitation. In this class, we're going to look at the progression of various conditions. The book goes into detail at a cellular level. We will explore some of this, but it is expected your previous studies in A&P have provided foundational understanding of the body systems. So instead, we will discuss the clinical presentation of the pathologies. These are referred to as signs and symptoms. We will consider how these signs and symptoms may affect our patient's function and their ability to participate in rehab or in life. So, what exactly is health? If you want, pause the lecture and think about that. What do you define health as? The WHO defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. They state that health is not just the absence of disease. To be thought of as healthy, you must be disease-free, but you must also be able to function normally in society. The text suggests that health is a continuum, with wellness on one end and illness or death on the other. Illness is a state of sickness or a deviation from a healthy state, or an unhealthy condition of mind or body. Illness is an unhealthy condition of mind or body. It has a broader meaning than disease, where disease is a pathological condition of the body or an abnormal entity with a characteristic group of signs and symptoms that affect the body. A disease will have a set of distinguishing signs and symptoms. So, what's the difference between a sign and a symptom? Well, signs are directly observable. They can be measured. They are evidence of the physical abnormality. So, signs are objective. Symptoms, on the other hand, are more subjective. They are reactions to the physical abnormality. Blood coming out of the nostrils would be a sign. It is apparent to the patient, the physician, and anyone around that something's wrong. But anxiety, low back pain, fatigue, these are all symptoms that only the patient can perceive. Signs and symptoms help diagnose the appropriate disease. However, it is worth noting that sometimes a diagnosis is a result of exclusion. Fibromyalgia is an example of a diagnosis that will come about as a result of excluding other diseases. There are a lot of ways we can experience illness, and in the medical field, we like to classify those ways. Acute illness is probably the most common. And what do you know about the word acute? Considering it is your first day, you may know nothing about the word acute. It essentially means new. So an acute illness will have a rapid onset and a short duration. These illnesses are usually self-limiting, and they will likely respond to a specific treatment and end in a full recovery. Acute illnesses tend to follow a specific sequence, and it should sound familiar to all of us. Let's imagine that you are starting to get a cold. The first thing that happens is this cognitive awareness. My throat seems a little scratchy today. And then there's our emotional response, which is usually denial. It's probably just allergies. I'm fine. Then comes anxiety. Oh no, I cannot get sick right now. I've got too much to do. But eventually, there will become acceptance. Okay, I've got a cold. So this cold may be self-limiting and end on its own, or we may find a need to go to the doctors and get dependent on a treatment plan to help it resolve. With a subacute illness, there is no set time frame. Subacute is the time between acute and chronic. That's the best way I can describe it to you. Basically, subacute illnesses are a gray zone. Symptoms will present longer than a few days, but less than several months. And sometimes there are some chronic conditions that will have flare-ups, and the flare-up will be referred to as a subacute illness. A subacute illness will last longer than an acute illness, but it cannot be a chronic illness because it will not meet the classifications. Let's talk about what is required for a disease to be considered chronic. A chronic illness will have one or more of the following. 1. Permanent impairment or disability. 2. Residual physical or cognitive disability and need for special rehab. 3. Long-term medical management. The intensity of a chronic illness can fluctuate. These patients can have acute exacerbations, which may require additional medical management. In our profession, this may be termed as an episode of care. Patients with chronic illnesses don't get to adjust to getting better. They have to adjust to getting different. And their ability to do that may have a lot to do with their pre-morbid psyche. For example, a dependent type person may become more dependent and crave a lot of advice or a lot of reassurance, whereas a young person with a risk-taking personality will generally still behave like that after, say, a spinal cord injury. Of course, the extent of the illness will also have an effect. Feelings of fear and anxiety over loss of control of the body are common, and denial is a defense mechanism that allows avoidance of the situation for as long as possible. It's usually a normal part of the process that will end with acceptance. So the Kubler-Ross stages of grief will apply to diagnoses of diseases and illness. You don't need to know these stages, but they tend to fall in this order: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. As a physical therapist assistant, you will see people going through these stages. That is particularly true when the illness will turn into disability. Disability is a word that we don't like to hear, and unfortunately, it is a public health problem. You will hear the words incidence and prevalence when people are discussing statistics. Let's define what they mean. Prevalence measures all cases of a condition among those at risk for developing it. An example could be the United States and everyone within it. So we're going to say those at risk for developing it are those in the United States, all age groups, all genders. We would be measuring the prevalence of disability within the United States, and that prevalence is nearly 20%. That is clearly a public health problem. Incidence refers to the number of new cases of a condition in a specified period of time. So let's put that into context. So we could say the incidence for people age 65 or older So now we're just looking at one group of the United States population, those 65 and older. They have a 40 to 43% chance of having a disability. When we talk about disability, we also have to talk about classification models. The Nagy model. Yeah, this already looks boring and uninteresting, but try to pay attention. So there are two models that give us a framework for describing disability, the Nagy and the ICF. Let's talk about the Nagy first. They are attempts at a uniform language. The Nagy model was developed in 1965. It describes an individual's health status as a product of the relationship between their health and function. It is defined by these four primary concepts: disease or pathology, impairments, functional limitations, and disability. The Nagy model is the typical model for clinical practice. It goes essentially like this: the pathology produces pain and impairments, and those pain and impairments will lead to functional limitations, which leads to disability. There are a lot of words up on this slide, and we need to discuss them. Impairment, functional limitation, disability. What exactly do each of these terms mean? Let's start with impairment. Impairment refers to abnormality at the tissue, visceral, or body system level, and it can be mental or emotional in nature. Impairments can be temporary or they can be permanent. Impairments are the result of a disease state that includes loss or abnormality of an anatomic or physiologic structure or its function. For example, a patient who suffered a stroke may now have muscle weakness. An abnormality at the neural level is causing an abnormality with the body tissue. Other times, impairments can exist without pathology. For example, someone could just be missing half of their foot. There's no disease there, but there's still an impairment. Now let's define functional limitations. Functional limitations are the inability to perform an action or a skill in a normal manner due to an impairment. So what do we consider function? Basic ADLs which are activities of daily living. So basic ADLs like bathing, feeding, house cleaning, shopping, those are all things that we need to do in order to function. So with a functional limitation, we may not be able to do one or more of those things, for example. So functional limitations are restrictions of the ability to perform at the level of a whole person in an efficient, typically expected or competent manner. For example, a patient with COPD will have difficulty breathing. So their functional limitation could mean that they need to take frequent rest to get dressed. So they can still do something. They're not unable to dress themselves, but they need to adapt. They need to do it differently. The way they have to do it now isn't efficient. It's not the typically expected way. You wouldn't expect to see someone sit down to catch their breath just because they put on their shirt. So they have a functional limitation. A disability would mean they couldn't put that shirt on no matter what. They're just unable to do a task. And that's when it's a disability. So a disability is the inability to perform or a limitation in the performance of actions. So maybe they can do a little bit, but they can't do it all. They still need help. Disabilities are associated with specific social roles like self-care, home management, work, being in the community, or leisure activities. When somebody can't engage in one or more of those things, they will be considered to have a disability. One of the things that we have learned as a society is that environmental barriers impose disability on other people. Before buses could pick up wheelchairs, people who lived in wheelchairs couldn't have access to community transportation. Before ramps were required everywhere, People with wheelchairs or people who couldn't get up and down stairs couldn't gain access to those buildings. Environmental barriers impose disability on those people. Here's a work disability example. Imagine two patients with Parkinson's disease. They have very similar clinical profiles. Both of them have moderate impairments such as rigidity and bradykinesia. If you have never seen anyone with Parkinson's, we'll say that they both have that characteristic slow shuffle gait pattern and they have slow, deliberate movements. Here's what makes them different: how they live. Person one lives alone and they have restricted all outside activities. Their son lives by and stops by once in the morning to help them get dressed and once in the evening to help them get ready for bed. They spend most of their time watching television. They're depressed and unemployed. The other individual is fully engaged in their social life. They receive assistance from a spouse in performing their daily activities like dressing, but their spouse will also drive them to work. And at work, they've added modifications so that they can maintain their employment. These two patients present very different work disability profiles, yet they have the same underlying pathology with similar impairments and similar functional limitations. What does one patient have that the other one lacks? Support from their spouse, support from their work, and they have the will to stay active. Now let's look at the ICF model, the International Classification of Function, Disability, and Health. It is defined by these 5 concepts: body functions and body structures, impairments, activity and participation, and environmental factors. Body functions is exactly what you think it means. It refers to the physiofunctions of the body systems, and this would include the psyche. Examples of body functions include mental, sensory, speech, organ, and just any of the systems and how they function. With body structures, they're looking at the anatomical parts of the body. So we're looking at the actual tissues, such as nervous tissue or muscle tissue, the blood vessels, and the heart itself. Impairments result from the problems in the body function or problems with the body structure that result in significant deviation or loss. In the ICF, activity refers to the execution of tasks by the individual. What can the patient do? Are they capable of using public transportation? Are they incapable of doing that? Participation refers to their involvement in life situations. What did the patient do before? What were their general tasks, demands? What was their level of communication, mobility, self-care, domestic life? Did they have interpersonal relationships? Were the community active, social? All these things will come into participation. Participation restrictions are going to be problems an individual may experience with involvement in these life situations. Would they be able to continue with the things that they used to do? If they can't, they are experiencing activity limitations. Environmental factors. Again, we're looking at those physical, social, and attitudinal environments in which people live. Do they have support? Access to resources? Can they afford the latest, greatest technology to help them? In this model, disability results from impairment. And disability is any restriction of the ability to perform an activity in what is considered a normal range for any human being. Let's talk about one of my patients. So this gentleman, we'll just call him Brad. So Brad has a pathology, two pathologies I was seeing for him, COPD and malnutrition. What do you think some of the signs of these two pathologies would be? A big one, you can start with COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, would be shortness of breath. With malnutrition, one of the common things that you will have is weakness. So is weakness a sign or a symptom? Sometimes we can feel weak and it would just be a symptom. Other times people are really weak, and that can actually be tested with manual muscle testing, which you'll learn later. So here we have his signs. I know he's weak. I can see it. He can barely get out of a chair. So these are the manifestations of his diseases. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the models and how it affects this patient. So just looking at him, you go, okay, he's a little weak, he's got a little shortness of breath. And what else is there that I need to be concerned about? So I saw this patient in home health. And when I arrived, I noticed his living environment immediately. So he had one of those split level homes where there was a flight of steps followed by a landing, and then there was another flight of steps down to the garage. And that's where the car was. If he went out the first door, there was another cement step well, and then he would have to take a sidewalk down a little hill to get to the car in a sloped driveway. So this was a very dangerous path for him. His safest route is to make it down the 2 flights of stairs to the garage to leave the home. He's too weak to do it. Not only because of the weakness in his legs and his body, he was unsteady and unstable, but also because of his respiratory problems. Shortness of breath, he would desaturate really quickly. And so getting him up and down the stairs was not an option. If something happened to him, an ambulance was going to have to come to get him. So he's trapped in his house. He's trapped on the top floor. Now, this is what's interesting. This has so much to do with family and environment and people's decisions. His wife lives in the basement. Instead of him living in the basement where it might make more sense so he could easily get the car and leave. But his wife lived in the basement where she would stay with their dogs. And so he's upstairs alone. She lives down in the basement. They are both hoarders. The entire house is covered in things. When I arrive, I come through this door, I go up the steps, and then there's a narrow path that I can follow into the kitchen. And in the kitchen, that's where I'd meet my patient. He would be sitting in a broken chair, and the only path that we had to work in was from that kitchen to his bedroom and back. The only place he had to sit in the entire house was this broken chair, or he could lay down in his bed. And the spot in his bed that he could lay down in was literally cleared just enough for his little tiny body to fit on the edge. That was his living environment. And this is the environment where he's supposed to get healthy and he's supposed to get stronger. So you can imagine he is depressed, moody, frustrated. He relies on his wife for everything, and she is not supportive. So here I am, and I need to exercise this gentleman. What kind of things do I need to be worried about with someone who's got shortness of breath, weakness, and they're also going to fatigue very quickly? I have to be concerned about their SpO2 levels. So I'm going to monitor their oxygen saturation to make sure I'm not causing respiratory distress. I also need to watch them to make sure that the signs of respiratory distress aren't growing, that they're within a place where we can control it. So I'm keeping track of that and telling them when to stop and when to rest. I'm also going to have to measure this patient's heart rate, his heart rate would go really, really high with activity. And that's because of the struggling to breathe and that weakness and just all the effort that he was putting into doing anything. His heart rate would shoot right up. So, in order to work with this patient, I have to be concerned about monitoring the vitals. So, as I mentioned, he couldn't leave the house because he's just too weak to make it up the flight of stairs, and he's too unsteady to go down as well. So, he would spend all of his time in home, dependent on his spouse for everything. Remember when I mentioned the stages of grief? He was still sort of in his denial phase, and he was also in his anger phase. And I'll say this about anger is it can be a useful energy as it was with this patient. So when he had finally had enough of his condition, he finally started working hard to get better and was able to eventually ascend and descend his 2 flights of stairs and go out regularly. I will say this about his environment as well, which was incredibly frustrating from my perspective. Because they were hoarders, I couldn't get to anything useful. They actually had quite a bit of furniture and other things that would be great to have this patient sit in and enjoy, but the house was covered in things. So the environment was a complete waste. So I think it's really important to think about that when you think about your patients. What environment are they in? Where are they going? What are their resources? What's their mentality like? Because originally this guy was failure to thrive. And it was only when he decided that he had had enough being angry about his condition that he finally began to thrive again and eat again and do better. He was really a perfect example of a patient that's coming to terms with being different instead of better. So he has a chronic disease. COPD is not going to get better. And somewhere along his journey, he learned to accept that he wasn't going to be better. But he could be different. And his different allowed him to have quite a bit of function back. And that really encouraged him as he began to progress. So it can be a hard journey, that transition from accept the chronic condition and what it can mean for your life. The Human Genome Project was an international scientific research project with the goal of determining the sequence of the nucleotide base pairs that make up human DNA. And they were to identify and map all the genes of the human genome from both a physical and functional standpoint. These genes carry the information that create our personal and familial traits. Inside the nucleus of any cell, there are chromosomes. How many pairs? I hope you remembered 23. Chromosomes are long strands of DNA. You should know that. Our genes are made up of DNA. You should also know that. They are a set of instructions, like a recipe book, to cook up the marvelousness that is each and every one of us. Researchers have identified about 30,000 genes in the human genome. At this time, I would like you to pause this video and go watch the videos that I've put in the course content folder on the Human Genome Project. Finding the blueprint for the human being is really exciting, as it may make it possible to offer molecular and cellular treatments for infectious diseases, inherited disorders, or even cancer. This research has also dispelled the myth that race or other ethnic-based biological differences existed, as 99.99% of the genome is the same across the human population. We know that individual variations in genes can increase the risk of disease, and it's very exciting to learn that researchers have located genes for some of our inherited diseases like Huntington's. Let's take just a few more moments to be wowed by DNA. How efficiently we process foods, how effectively we fight infection, our response to exercise interventions, it may all be mediated or influenced in a large part by variations in genes. A change in the normal DNA of a particular gene is called a mutation, and mutations cause most illnesses, including cancers. They usually occur during cell division to replace worn out cells. During the process, instead of a healthy cell, a mutation occurs. Mutations cannot be inherited. It is just a bad copy. In genetic engineering, they would use a vector to deliver a healthy gene to a cell. A vector is like a carrier, and it is generally a genetically altered virus. The hope is the new gene would fix the cell. Alternatively, they've used vectors to deliver a gene to alter a cell so that it produces toxins for cell suicide. Vectors are the transporters of gene therapy, and they are frequently genetically altered viruses, though non-viral vectors are being developed. Gene therapy. Gene therapy is an experimental technique that uses genes to treat or prevent disease. In the future, this technique may allow doctors to treat a disorder by inserting a gene into the patient's cell instead of using drugs or surgery. Researchers are testing several approaches to gene therapy. One way is by replacing a mutated gene that causes disease with a healthy copy of the gene. Another method is inactivating or knocking out a mutated gene that is functioning improperly. And a third method is to introduce a brand new gene into the body to help fight the disease. Although gene therapy is a promising treatment option for a number of diseases, including inherited disorders and some types of cancer, as well as some viral infections, the technique remains risky, and it is still under study to make sure that it will be safe and effective. Gene therapy is currently being tested only for diseases that have no other cures. There is controversy over using gene therapy to do things such as enhance an unborn baby cosmetically or to increase their intelligence. We put ourselves at a risk of ethnic cleansing by making these designer babies that could lead to or cause permanent changes in the gene pool. Other things that are controversial are things like genetic testing to screen job applicants or genetic testing for health insurance. So there's a lot of controversy and some fear around what it could mean to know so much about our DNA and how to alter it. One of the controversies I haven't mentioned yet is gene doping. What about that? It's banned in all sports. So there's a protein in our body called myostatin, and myostatin is responsible for inhibiting muscle differentiation and growth. So by removing the myostatin gene or otherwise limiting its expression, this leads to an increase in muscle size and power. As you can imagine, this would give an athlete an unnatural advantage. Erythropoietin is the injection of red blood cells, or blood doping, which is already illegal. EPO increases the number of red blood cells in circulation. By doing this, it will increase the amount of oxygen that flows and becomes available to the muscles. This will enhance an athlete's endurance. These next two slides seem to come from a little bit out of nowhere, but they are at the end of this chapter, so we will talk about adverse drug reactions now. These are reactions to medications or their side effects. There are several classifications. A drug-drug interaction occurs when the medication interacts unfavorably with another drug. A drug-disease interaction occurs when the medication causes an existing disease to worsen. Side effects are predicted pharmacological effects. ADRs are classified in 1 to 4 ways, and you will need to know the differences between them. It's classified as mild if no antidote or no therapy is needed. It is classified as moderate if a change in drug therapy is required. The patient may also require prolonged hospitalization or require special treatment. It's quite a step up from mild to moderate. With severe, it is potentially life-threatening, and the patient will require specific treatment of the adverse reaction. And lethal is exactly what it sounds like. Directly or indirectly leads to the death of the person. The onset may occur within minutes or it could take days. ADRs have been declared a national public health problem, and they are often preventable. The CDC reports inappropriate medications are prescribed to older adults in about 1 out of every 12 visits. That's 8% of the time. There are many risk factors, but age is most prevalent due to the physiologic changes, the greater frailty, and the increased number of diseases, as well as the presence of polypharmacy, which is taking more than one drug. Why does this matter? I mean, PTAs don't give medication anyway, right? Well, it matters because you will need to be able to spot the signs or the symptoms of an adverse drug reaction, especially if you work in acute care. In acute care, they are working on getting that right balance of medications. And the PT or the PTA is the one that's getting the patient out of bed and walking. It's our job to be alert, and we have to notify the medical staff if the patient presents with any of these signs and symptoms. Take a moment and read over these signs and symptoms. You'll notice one frustrating similarity is that these signs and symptoms could also be a result of the patient's disease or their illness. What we have to do is document what we observe, and we have to attempt to find out from the patient or from their family members if this is normal behavior. If what they're experiencing is abnormal, they may be having an adverse drug reaction. Corticosteroids get its own slide because corticosteroids are big medicine. Corticosteroids are a naturally occurring hormone that is produced by the adrenal cortex and the gonadal tissue. They are a powerful anti-inflammatory, but they can have serious side effects. Adverse drug reactions include fluid retention. Your patient may suddenly develop what is called a moon face or a big belly. It may result in an increased risk of infection because corticosteroids actually suppress the immune system as well. This makes it more difficult to fight off infections, so you better wash your hands if you're taking those corticosteroids. Another side effect that is of special concern to us is the steroid-induced myopathy. The myopathy is muscle pain. We must keep in mind a patient on a steroid medication is more prone to muscle strain, tendon rupture, or unexpected weaknesses. These patients are also at a risk for bone fractures because corticosteroids increase the risk of osteoporosis. Use with caution. Exercise your patient with caution. In the Intro to Path folder, you will find your Muddy Points end of chapter questions. These are optional. They are there to help you study and make sure that you understand the content and how to begin to apply it. You also have the discussion board with this topic. You can work on these questions together, help each other through them, bring up other questions that you have on the PowerPoint. Again, you can help each other. Please provide page numbers whenever possible, and I will also come in and help as needed. Finally, I want to say to you, smoking will kill you, bacon will kill you, but smoking bacon will cure it.